Flashing police lights cut through the humid coastal air as an aggressive rookie officer pinned a decorated black Marine colonel against the hood of a dusty sedan. What should have been a routine traffic stop just outside the heavily fortified gates of a major military installation was turning into a dangerous battle over authority and jurisdiction. When the rookie snapped the handcuffs shut, he had no idea he had just detained the man who commanded the entire base. Then, the steel gates came crashing closed. Dust curled behind the tires of an aging Ford Taurus as it moved steadily along the lonely coastal highway leading toward the southern perimeter of the installation. Behind the wheel sat Colonel Darius Whitaker, a man whose calm, restrained manner gave little hint of the enormous responsibility resting on his shoulders. More than 2 decades of active duty service showed in the deep lines around his eyes. He had commanded infantry battalions in some of the harshest fighting grounds in Fallujah and Helmand province, places where hesitation could cost lives. Now, though, Whitaker was simply an exhausted man trying to get home. He had just endured a grueling stretch of high-level strategy meetings at the Pentagon, navigating the slow, complicated machinery of military politics. His perfectly pressed uniform, polished insignia, and rows of ribbons were nowhere in sight. Instead, he wore faded jeans, a plain grey t-shirt, and an old leather jacket softened by years of use. And preferred it that way when he was off-duty. Whitaker deliberately drove an older, unremarkable car and dressed like any ordinary traveler. For a little while, at least, he could step away from the constant salutes, formal briefings, and rigid ceremony that shaped nearly every part of his professional life. Several miles behind him, a marked Oceanside Police Department cruiser moved through the darkness. At the wheel was Officer Travis Kellerman. Kellerman was driven by a dangerous mix of ambition, insecurity, and unchecked bias. Even though he had only been on patrol for a few years, he had already developed a quiet reputation among other officers for pushing boundaries, turning small infractions into major confrontations, and searching for excuses to prove that he was in control. I hated perimeter patrol. The military personnel usually remained inside the guarded installation, leaving him with empty commercial strips, quiet residential roads, and long stretches of uneventful highway. Kellerman wanted action. More than that, he wanted a dramatic arrest that would make people in the department notice him and feed the fragile sense of importance he carried everywhere he went. When he spotted the taillights of Whitaker's Taurus ahead, Kellerman narrowed his eyes. The car was traveling exactly at the speed limit. It held a steady line and showed no sign of reckless driving. To a reasonable officer, it would have looked like a law-abiding driver heading home. To Kellerman, it looked suspiciously careful. He accelerated and closed the distance until the cruiser was riding close behind the Taurus. His headlights filled Whitaker's rearview mirror and lit the back of the colonel's head. Kellerman entered the license plate into his onboard computer. The system was slow to return information while it processed the out-of-state registration. Whitaker had recently registered the vehicle in his home state of Georgia, something entirely ordinary for military personnel who moved between duty stations. Kellerman immediately treated it as another reason for suspicion. He did not wait for dispatch to finish the check. Instead, he watched the Taurus touch the painted white line at the edge of the lane for the briefest instant. The movement was so slight that it barely qualified as a drift, but Kellerman had already made up his mind. That tiny moment was all the excuse he wanted. He reached for the controls and activated the emergency lights. The highway exploded in red and blue flashes. Harsh strobes bounced off the dusty trunk of the Ford and poured into the cabin. Whitaker released a long, tired breath and looked into the rearview mirror, squinting against the glare. He knew he had not committed a traffic violation. His driving record was spotless, and decades of combat and tactical training had made situational awareness almost instinctive. He checked his surroundings. The entrance to the Marine Corps installation was close ahead. A painted yellow line crossed the pavement near the gate, clearly marking the point where local authority ended and federal military property began. Whitaker switched on his right turn signal, slowed smoothly, and pulled into the well-lit approach lane near the guard shack. His Taurus came to a stop just beyond the jurisdictional line. Kellerman stopped directly behind him and threw the cruiser into park. He either failed to notice the boundary or decided it did not matter. His attention was fixed entirely on the driver. The rookie stepped out into the cool coastal air with one hand resting heavily on the grip of his service weapon. He loosened the retention strap and approached with a slow, exaggerated swagger. As he came alongside the Taurus, he aimed a powerful tactical flashlight directly into the driver's side mirror, deliberately flooding Whitaker's vision with white light. Whitaker rolled down the window and placed both hands firmly at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel. It was not fear. It was discipline, caution, and hard-learned awareness. As a black man in America, even one who commanded thousands of armed Marines, Whitaker understood how quickly a late-night traffic stop could turn dangerous when an officer made assumptions before asking questions. He kept every movement deliberate, every breath controlled, and every word measured. "Evening, officer," Whitaker said in a deep, steady voice. "Is there a problem?" Kellerman stopped behind the center pillar of the car, keeping himself partly outside Whitaker's direct line of sight. Then he aimed the flashlight straight into the colonel's face. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Kellerman barked, ignoring the question. "And keep your hands where I can see them, buddy." Whitaker squinted through the glare but did not move. "My wallet is in my right back pocket, officer. My registration is in the glove compartment. I am going to reach for them now. Is that understood?" Kellerman leaned closer and sneered. "I didn't ask for a play-by-play. Get the documents, move slow." Whitaker shifted carefully, reached into his back pocket, and removed his worn leather wallet. He took out his Georgia driver's license, along with his military identification card, and handed both through the window. He expected the Department of Defense identification to settle the situation quickly. It clearly showed that Kellerman was dealing with a senior military officer at the entrance to the very installation where that officer served. Kellerman barely looked at it. In his mind, he saw only a black man in an old car near a military base, carrying an out-of-state license. His assumptions had already hardened into a story, and he was no longer interested in facts that challenged it. He shoved the military identification card back toward Whitaker. "I don't care about your gym membership or whatever fake contractor badge this is," Kellerman snapped. "I asked for registration and insurance. What are you doing out here? You're a long way from Georgia, boy." That last word hit Whitaker harder than the flashlight, the sirens, or the accusation. Something cold settled over his expression. He had been called many things during his life and career, but he had not heard that particular kind of racial contempt directed at him since he was much younger. The insult was unmistakable. Still, Whitaker did not raise his voice. He did not look away. "Officer Kellerman," he said, reading the nameplate on the rookie's chest, "I suggest you look closely at that identification. I am Colonel Darius Whitaker, United States Marine Corps. You have stopped me inside the jurisdictional boundary of the military installation I command. I am returning to my quarters." Kellerman laughed. "Right. And I'm the commandant of the Marine Corps. You expect me to believe a guy driving a junker in a dirty t-shirt is a full-bird colonel? Step out of the vehicle. Now." The air seemed to tighten around them. Whitaker remained seated, with both hands visible. His fingers closed around the steering wheel until the skin across his knuckles lightened. Inside his mind, he was making the kind of rapid tactical assessment that had kept him alive in combat. He was unarmed. He was seated in a vulnerable position. The officer beside him was armed, agitated, and clearly operating from bias and a need to dominate. Refusing to exit the vehicle, even when the reason for the stop was unjust, could give Kellerman an excuse to escalate with force. Whitaker lowered his voice, and the calm authority in it became unmistakable. "Officer, I am stepping out of the vehicle. I am unarmed. I strongly advise you to contact your watch commander and verify my identity before you make a catastrophic career mistake." Kellerman yanked open the driver's door and stepped back. He drew his taser and aimed the laser at Whitaker's chest. "Shut your mouth and get out. Face away from me. Do it now." Whitaker slowly swung his legs out of the car and rose to his full height, standing well over 6 feet tall. He was broader and more imposing than Kellerman had expected. Even in worn civilian clothes, Whitaker carried himself like a man who had spent his entire adult life in uniform. His spine was straight. His shoulders were squared. His chin remained level. He turned his back to Kellerman, interlaced his fingers, and placed his hands behind his head before being told. I knew the procedure. Kellerman grabbed the collar of Whitaker's leather jacket and shoved him hard against the dusty roof of the Taurus. The impact forced the air from Whitaker's lungs and sent a sharp burst of pain through his shoulder. Kellerman kicked his legs wider apart with the toe of his heavy boot, forcing the colonel into a vulnerable position. "You think you can lie to me?" Kellerman hissed near the back of Whitaker's neck as he searched the colonel's pockets. "You think flashing some fake military identification makes you untouchable? People like you come around the base looking to steal equipment or sell drugs to recruits. I know exactly what you are." Whitaker clenched his jaw against the humiliation and the pain. Straight ahead, less than 200 yards away, the huge illuminated structure of the main gate stood like a fortress. Reinforced barriers guarded the roadway. Ballistic glass surrounded the guard station. Armed Marines stood watch beneath powerful lights. This was Whitaker's installation. Kellerman's cruiser was sitting across the painted yellow boundary. Both men were now clearly on federal property. "You have crossed into federal jurisdiction, officer," Whitaker said, calmly, even as anger beneath his control. "You do not have legal authority to conduct this arrest on this side of the boundary without military police present. Release me." Kellerman reacted as if the calm statement were a personal challenge. He jerked Whitaker's arms down and twisted both wrists behind his back. Steel handcuffs closed with a sharp metallic ratchet. Kellerman tightened them until the edges bit into the skin over Whitaker's wrists. "I have jurisdiction wherever I say I have jurisdiction, buddy," he growled. He spun the handcuffed colonel around and shoved him against the side of the Taurus. "You are under arrest for driving under the influence, failure to obey a lawful order, and resisting arrest. We'll see how confident you are in a holding cell." Whitaker stood upright, despite his hands being bound behind him. He looked directly into Kellerman's eyes. There was no panic in his face. There was only a cold, controlled fury. "You have just unlawfully detained a federal officer on a United States military installation," Whitaker said. "When this is over, you will not have a badge, and you may be facing federal charges." Up the road, behind the ballistic glass of the gate guard station, Corporal Isaiah Brooks had been watching the encounter. Brooks was 22 years old, sharply dressed in his camouflage uniform, with his protective helmet secured and his M4 service rifle slung across his chest. He was part of the first line of defense for the entire installation. When the police lights had first appeared, Brooks simply noted the traffic stop and assumed it was an ordinary civilian matter near the gate. But the moment he saw the local officer drag the driver from the car and force him against the vehicle, his instincts changed. Brooks lifted a pair of military-grade binoculars and adjusted the focus. The powerful lenses cut through the flashing lights and brought the scene into sharp detail. He studied the face of the man pinned against the Taurus. Then he froze. Brooks lowered the binoculars, blinked, and raised them again. There was no mistake. I knew that face. He had recently stood at rigid attention while that very man pinned a Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal to his chest. He knew the jawline, the intense eyes, and the unmistakable posture. Brooks dropped the binoculars and turned toward the communications console, his heart pounding. "Sergeant of the Guard, this is the main gate," Brooks shouted into the radio. "We have a code red situation at the perimeter. Local police are assaulting and detaining base actual." Static cracked through the speaker before the duty sergeant answered. "Main gate, repeat your last. Did you say base actual?" "Affirmative," Brooks answered. An Oceanside Police Department officer crossed the federal boundary. He has Colonel Whitaker in handcuffs and is using force against him beside his vehicle. I need the quick reaction force and the provost marshal here immediately. He is on our side of the line. Inside the fortified provost marshal's office, the message landed with stunning force. A local patrol officer physically detaining the base commander on federal property was so unusual that it hardly seemed possible. The Marines did not waste time questioning whether it sounded believable. Alarms came alive across the military police compound. Armed military police rushed toward their response vehicles. At the gate, Brooks watched Kellerman begin pulling the handcuffed colonel toward the back of the police cruiser. Kellerman pushed down on Whitaker's head, preparing to force him into the cramped rear compartment. Brooks knew the response force was coming, but he also knew the officer might leave before they arrived. He moved back into the guard station, opened the red emergency panel on the wall, and exposed a large illuminated control. He drove his palm down on it. Powerful warning sirens erupted across the installation. The sound rolled through the coastal air and seemed to shake the ground beneath Kellerman's boots. Just as he was about to push Whitaker into the cruiser, Kellerman stopped and looked around in confusion. The massive Delta crash barriers were rising from the pavement. Thick, reinforced steel plates, designed to stop a fully loaded explosive vehicle traveling at highway speed, surged upward directly in front of the police cruiser. At the same moment, heavy steel gates closed across the exit lanes. Kellerman was trapped. Blinding searchlights snapped on from the guard towers and converged on the cruiser. Their beams covered Kellerman, Whitaker, and the vehicles in a hard white glare that left nowhere to hide. Kellerman raised an arm to shield his eyes. "What is going on?" he shouted, his confidence suddenly breaking apart. He reached for his radio, but the base alarm swallowed almost every other sound. Whitaker stood perfectly still in the harsh light. He looked at the rookie officer and allowed the faintest, coldest smile to touch the corner of his mouth. "That is the sound of your career-ending officer," he said. "I told you. You are on my base." Before Kellerman could respond, heavy diesel engines roared through the sirens. Armored military police vehicles swept into position behind the deployed barriers, emergency lights flashing. Doors opened almost in unison. A squad of military police marines, in full tactical gear, poured out. Protective vests covered their torsos. Ballistic helmets protected their heads. M4 rifles were held ready as they spread into a disciplined tactical formation. At the front of the group was Captain Adrian Mercer, the provost marshal on duty. His expression tightened when he saw the installation commander in handcuffs beside a local police cruiser. Mercer raised one hand, and the Marines immediately formed a secure perimeter around Kellerman's vehicle. The rookie suddenly found himself standing inside a ring of armed federal troops. "Oceanside police officer," Mercer called through a handheld loudspeaker. "Step away from the detainee immediately. Keep your hands clearly visible and move away from the vehicle. You are operating outside your jurisdiction and are in violation of federal law." Kellerman's heartbeat hammered in his throat. He looked at the rifles, the armored vehicles, and the silent faces surrounding him. The balance of power had changed so completely that he seemed unable to process it. "Back off!" Kellerman shouted, but fear cracked through his voice. "This is a local police matter. This man is under arrest for driving under the influence and resisting. I am taking him in." Without thinking, he let one hand drift toward his holstered firearm. The reaction was immediate. The Marines brought their rifles up in a controlled, defensive posture, every muzzle aligned toward the threat in front of them. "Do not touch your weapon," Mercer ordered, lowering the loudspeaker and drawing his own sidearm. "If you attempt to unholster that firearm on a federal military installation, heroine, you will be treated as an armed threat. Step away from the colonel." Sweat ran down Kellerman's face. His breathing became shallow and uneven. Slowly, he raised both hands and stepped backward until his body touched the side of his cruiser. He glanced around for an escape route, but there was none. For the first time, the weight of what he had done broke through his ego. "Unlock the handcuffs," Mercer ordered. "Do it slowly." Kellerman reached toward his belt with shaking hands, removed the key, and moved toward Whitaker. His fingers trembled so badly that it took several attempts to guide the tiny key into the lock. The steel cuff opened with a sharp click. Whitaker brought his hands forward and rubbed his bruised wrists. He did not stare at the marks. He kept his eyes on Kellerman. Then, the colonel straightened his old leather jacket and stepped away from the Taurus. He did not need a uniform to control the space. His bearing alone changed the atmosphere. "Captain Mercer," Whitaker said. "Sir." Mercer holstered his sidearm, came to attention, and delivered a crisp salute. Every Marine in the perimeter immediately lowered their weapons and followed him, snapping into sharp salutes for the man standing there in a plain t-shirt and worn jacket. "Stand down, Marines," Whitaker ordered as he returned the salute. Then he looked at Mercer. "Captain, disarm this officer and secure his communications equipment. He is to be detained in the Provost Marshal's holding facility for attempted kidnapping, assault on a federal officer, and unlawful entry onto a military installation. Then contact the Oceanside Chief of Police and tell him to come here in person." Kellerman opened his mouth to protest, but no meaningful explanation came out. Two Marines stepped forward, took control of his arms, and removed his duty belt, service weapon, radio, and badge. They treated him not as a fellow law enforcement officer, but as an armed outsider who had crossed onto protected federal property and refused repeated warnings. As the stunned rookie was escorted toward the armored vehicles, Whitaker looked toward the guard station. Corporal Brooks was standing at his post with his rifle secured, watching everything unfold. Whitaker gave the young Marine a small nod of approval. The system had worked, the boundary had held. Then, Colonel Darius Whitaker turned away from the emergency lights and walked calmly toward the gate. Finally ready to go home. The fluorescent lights inside the Provost Marshal's holding area buzzed with a low, irritating hum. Travis Kellerman sat on a rigid steel bench, no longer wearing a gun, a radio, or a badge. His uniform remained on his body, but without the tools and authority that had given him confidence, it felt suddenly empty. The aggressive energy that had driven him on the highway was gone. In its place was a cold dread that settled deeper every time a military police officer passed the barred door. Kellerman was no longer controlling the encounter. He was the one waiting behind a secured door, dependent on people he had insulted, challenged, and underestimated. Elsewhere, the telephone rang in the home of Oceanside Police Chief Gregory Halstead. Halstead answered, with the irritation of a man who was not accustomed to being disturbed. That irritation vanished as soon as his watch commander began describing what had happened at the military gate. A civilian traffic stop near the installation would have been routine. Detaining a Marine would have created paperwork and political headaches, but an officer crossing onto federal property, assaulting the commanding officer and trying to remove him from the installation was something entirely different. Halstead felt his stomach tighten. This was not a problem that could be solved with a quiet internal review. It had the potential to bring federal investigators, military attorneys, and the Department of Defense directly into his department. He dressed quickly while his mind moved through every possible damage control option. There was another complication. Kellerman was not just an ordinary rookie. How was the nephew of State Senator Graham Kellerman, a powerful local politician with influence over important funding, connected to the police department? The department had hired Travis partly as a political favor, even though troubling warning signs had appeared during his psychological evaluation and early performance reviews. Now that favor was threatening to become a disaster for everyone who had protected him. When Chief Halstead arrived at the Military Installations Visitor Center, he did not receive the familiar professional courtesy usually extended between law enforcement agencies. Military police searched his vehicle carefully, checked his credentials repeatedly, and escorted him onto the base under tight supervision. The drive toward the command headquarters felt unusually long. The vast installation stretched around him in the darkness, quiet but powerful, like something enormous that had been disturbed from sleep. Inside the command building, the atmosphere was completely different from the chaotic roadside scene. Colonel Darius Whitaker sat behind a large mahogany desk. He had showered, shaved, and changed into a perfectly pressed service uniform. Gold eagles gleamed on his collar. Rows of ribbons across his chest told the story of years spent carrying responsibilities that most people would never understand. Standing beside him was Major Camille Rhodes, the installation's senior military legal officer. Rhodes was brilliant, precise, and known for approaching legal problems with almost surgical discipline. In civilian practice, an attorney with her ability would command an extraordinary fee. When Halstead entered, he immediately stepped forward and extended his hand. "Colonel Whitaker, I cannot apologize enough for what happened," Halstead began, forcing a diplomatic tone into his voice. "This was a terrible misunderstanding." A young officer became overzealous. "If you release him into my custody, I promise you he will face serious internal discipline." Whitaker did not take the offered hand. He simply looked at Halstead for a long moment, then motioned toward the hard-backed chair opposite the desk. "Sit down, Chief." Halstead slowly lowered his hand and sat. Whitaker leaned forward. "We need to be very clear about the language being used here," he said. "This was not a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding is a misplaced report or an incorrectly entered form. Your officer crossed a clearly marked federal boundary, illegally detained a federal officer, used force against him, and attempted to remove him from a military installation while acting under the authority of his badge." Whitaker's voice remained controlled, but there was no softness in it. "Those actions create federal exposure." Major Rhodes stepped forward and placed a thick file on the desk. "Chief Halstead," she said, "Officer Travis Kellerman is being processed for the violations documented in this file. The relevant federal statutes include Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 111, concerning assaulting, resisting, or impeding certain officers or employees. They also include Title 18, Section 1201 concerning kidnapping and Title 18, Section 242 concerning deprivation of rights under color of law. Halstead's face tightened. Rhodes continued. We also completed an initial review of Officer Kellerman's background and complaint history. This does not appear to be his first incident involving racially charged escalation. It is also not his first administrative complaint. The fact that he was assigned to patrol near this installation, despite those warning signs, raises serious questions about your department's supervision and judgment. Sweat formed along Halstead's forehead despite the cool air in the office. I knew the military had prepared its case carefully, but he still had one political argument left. Colonel, Major, I understand why you're angry, he said, lowering his voice, but we also have to consider the larger consequences. Travis Kellerman is Senator Graham Kellerman's nephew. If the military turns this into a major federal prosecution, the senator can make funding difficult. He can interfere with municipal agreements. He can create political problems for the base and turn this into a public fight between local authorities and the military. Halstead leaned forward as though offering a practical solution. Nobody benefits from that. Let me handle this quietly. He will resign. You have my word. Silence filled the room. Whitaker slowly leaned back in his chair. The expression on his face was not anger alone. It was disappointment mixed with disgust. You think I am worried about local contracts right now, Chief? Halstead said nothing. Whitaker continued. I command thousands of United States Marines. I am responsible for their safety, their training, and their lives. Many of them are young black and brown men and women who drive beyond these gates every night. If your officer is willing to drag a full bird colonel out of his car, dismiss his military identification, call him boy, and put him in handcuffs outside the gate of the installation he commands, then I need to know what he has been doing to young privates and corporals when no one is watching. Halstead opened his mouth, but Whitaker raised one hand and stopped him. This is not a negotiation. I am not releasing him to you. He will be transferred to federal investigators for a civil rights investigation. You are dismissed. Halstead left the office, understanding that his department was no longer controlling the situation. He did not accept defeat quietly. The chief contacted District Attorney Victor Langford, a polished and ambitious prosecutor who had built much of his political standing by defending the police union and presenting himself as an unwavering ally of local law enforcement. Longford arrived at the base carrying a briefcase full of legal arguments and accompanied by two senior investigators. He demanded a meeting with Colonel Whitaker and entered the command suite convinced he could pressure the military into backing down. Whitaker remained behind his desk with Major Rhodes at his side. Halstead stood nearby. Langford paced across the room with the confidence of a man accustomed to intimidating people who feared his office. Colonel, you are overstepping your authority, Langford said, and, frankly, you are creating a legal problem for yourself. He placed a flash drive on Whitaker's desk. I reviewed the dispatch records and the dash camera footage from Officer Kellerman's cruiser. The footage shows your vehicle drifting across the lane. When Kellerman activated his emergency lights, you failed to stop immediately and continued toward the federal boundary. Longford paused, then smiled. Under the doctrine of hot pursuit, a local law enforcement officer can cross a jurisdictional boundary when pursuing a fleeing suspect. That means the stop was lawful. The force you are calling an assault was simply an officer attempting to control a non-compliant driver. His smile widened. If you do not release Officer Kellerman, I am prepared to pursue state charges against you for evading arrest and resisting a peace officer. Whitaker did not react. He looked at the flash drive, then turned his eyes toward Major Rhodes. Rhodes gave Langford a small, almost clinical smile. Mr. Langford, that is an interesting version of events, she said. Before you decide to file anything, perhaps we should review the evidence together. She moved to a large monitor mounted on the wall and used a wireless keyboard to bring the display to life. The dash camera footage you referenced appears to have a problem, Rhodes explained. The version uploaded to the county system contains a sudden break immediately before Colonel Whitaker reaches the jurisdictional line. The missing portion happens to remove the part showing that his signal was activated and his vehicle was already coming to a controlled stop before Officer Kellerman exited his cruiser. Longford's expression changed. Technology glitches happen, he replied. The essential facts are still the same. No, Whitaker said, his voice suddenly filling the room. The essential fact is that you are standing in a federal command office using altered evidence to threaten the person who was unlawfully detained. Rhodes pressed another key. The screen divided into several high-definition surveillance feeds. What your office did not account for, Mr. Langford, she said, is that the gate recently received an upgraded Department of Defense surveillance system. The first feed used infrared thermal imaging. It showed the heat signatures of both vehicles and clearly demonstrated that Whitaker had slowed in a controlled, ordinary manner. The second feed came from the license plate recognition system. It recorded the speed and path of the Taurus and showed stable driving with no meaningful lane deviation. The third angle came from an elevated security camera. It captured the exact position where Kellerman parked his cruiser. The yellow jurisdictional line was unmistakable, and Kellerman was clearly standing on the federal side when he initiated the detention. The final feed included high-definition video and directional audio from the guard area. The recording captured the entire exchange without interruption. Kellerman's dismissive treatment of the military identification was audible, so was the racially charged language. The handcuffs could be heard closing, and Whitaker's repeated warnings about federal jurisdiction were preserved clearly. Rhodes turned from the screen toward Langford. This military surveillance system provides a continuous, independent record. It shows that Colonel Whitaker committed no meaningful traffic violation, did not flee, did not resist, and remained compliant while Officer Kellerman escalated the encounter and crossed onto federal property. Whitaker rose from his chair and placed both hands on the desk. Langford instinctively took a small step backward. "Here is the situation you are facing now," Whitaker said quietly. "Kellerman is already under investigation for federal offenses, but by bringing altered footage into this office and using it to threaten me into releasing him, you and Chief Halstead may have created an entirely separate obstruction issue." Halstead looked ill. Longford's confidence disappeared. "What do you want?" he asked, his eyes briefly shifting toward the door. "I already told the chief what I want," Whitaker said. "Kellerman goes to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but now I want more than that." He moved around the desk and stood close enough that Langford could not pretend this was an abstract political disagreement. "I want a joint civil rights review led by the Department of Justice, not by your county office. Every arrest, traffic stop, use of force report, and incident report connected to Travis Kellerman's entire patrol career needs to be examined." Whitaker's eyes hardened. If he wrongfully targeted any of my Marines or any civilian, those cases need to be reopened. If convictions were built on fabricated evidence or unlawful conduct, they need to be challenged and corrected. Then he added one final condition. Your offices will make a public statement. You will not use my name as a shield, a distraction, or a political weapon. You will state that Officer Kellerman was removed from duty for serious misconduct, transferred to federal authorities, and that your agencies are cooperating with the Department of Justice investigation. Whitaker pointed toward the surveillance screen. "If either of you tries to distort what happened, if Senator Kellerman attempts to retaliate against this base, or if anyone tries to bury this investigation, Major Rhodes will provide the unedited military recordings and the evidence concerning the altered police footage to the appropriate federal authorities and major news organizations." Whitaker walked to the door and opened it. Military police officers were waiting in the hallway. "Contact the Department of Justice and begin the process," he said. "Then leave my base." Not long after, a convoy of dark federal vehicles passed through the fortified gate under military escort. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had arrived. Stepping from the lead vehicle was Special Agent in Charge, Marcus Vance, a veteran federal investigator known for methodically dismantling corruption cases without being distracted by local politics. Vance was not interested in municipal budgets, union pressure, family connections, or the reputation of the people involved. He cared about the evidence and the federal statutes that applied to it. The dossier Major Rhodes had sent to the Bureau was enough to trigger an immediate response. Inside the holding facility, Travis Kellerman had spent hours trapped in mounting fear. The fluorescent lights above him provided no comfort. Every time he closed his eyes, he remembered the military police surrounding his cruiser and the moment his authority disappeared. When the heavy door opened, Kellerman jumped to his feet. For one brief second, he expected Chief Halstead to appear and take him home with a warning, a suspension, or some private agreement that would make the problem disappear. Instead, Marcus Vance entered with 2 federal agents and Captain Mercer. "Travis Kellerman," Vance said, his voice calm and final. "I am Special Agent in Charge Marcus Vance with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are being transferred into federal custody in connection with allegations of attempted kidnapping, assault on a federal officer, and deprivation of rights under color of law. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Kellerman backed away until his shoulders touched the wall. "Wait, my uncle is Senator Graham Kellerman. Chief Halstead told me this would be handled internally. You can't do this." Vance did not raise his voice. "Your chief is now part of an obstruction investigation, and your uncle does not control the United States Department of Justice. Turn around, Mr. Kellerman. You are no longer acting as a police officer in this matter. You are a federal suspect." Federal handcuffs closed around Kellerman's wrists. The reversal was impossible for him to ignore. I was escorted through the facility and out into the bright coastal light. As the agents led him towards the waiting vehicle, he looked across the compound and saw Colonel Darius Whitaker standing near the command building. Whitaker wore clean combat utilities. His posture was rigid, his expression unreadable. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply watched Kellerman being taken away under federal authority. Far from the base, inside a polished office at the state capitol, Senator Graham Kellerman slammed down his telephone in frustration. I was accustomed to influence. Budgets moved when he applied pressure. Local officials returned his calls. Political favors were rarely denied twice. But the situation involving his nephew was different. The senator had already contacted people with connections to the Pentagon and demanded that Colonel Whitaker be reprimanded and Travis released. Every attempt had failed. The Pentagon's legislative staff refused to interfere. Senior military leaders had already reviewed the unedited surveillance footage transmitted by Major Rhodes. They had watched a decorated Marine commander remain compliant, while a local officer dismissed his identification, used racially charged language, crossed onto federal property, and placed him in handcuffs. The Department of Defense did not turn against Whitaker. It stood behind him. Military leadership formally supported the request for a federal civil rights investigation and prosecution based on the evidence. Senator Kellerman finally understood the size of the problem his nephew had created. Travis had not simply picked a fight with an unknown driver in an old car. He had confronted the commander of a United States Marine Corps installation on federal property, and the entire encounter had been recorded by an independent military security system. Politically, the senator had almost no safe path forward. If he publicly defended his nephew, he would be defending an officer accused of racially motivated misconduct against a decorated military commander. The evidence was already too strong to dismiss as rumor or misunderstanding. So the senator did what political survival demanded. He prepared a statement condemning his nephew's conduct and distancing himself from the case. Back at the installation, word of the confrontation spread rapidly through the barracks. Many of the younger Marines had experienced uncomfortable encounters of their own with local police outside the gates. Some had been stopped repeatedly. Some believed they had been treated differently because of how they looked or what they drove. For them, the story carried a meaning larger than one colonel and one officer. Their commander had not merely spoken about leadership, discipline, or protecting his people. He had stood on the jurisdictional line, absorbed the humiliation without losing control, and then used lawful authority, documentation, and military procedure to force accountability. Corporal Isaiah Brooks was later ordered to report to the commanding officer's office. He arrived with his uniform immaculate and his boots polished until they reflected the light. He stood at attention in front of Whitaker's desk, visibly nervous despite everything he had already done. Whitaker looked up from a stack of reports, his expression softened slightly. "At ease, Corporal." Brooks relaxed his stance and clasped his hands behind his back. "Sir," Whitaker leaned back. "You acted decisively at the gate. You identified a serious threat, recognized when normal procedure was no longer enough, and secured the installation before the situation could get worse. You protected the perimeter, and you protected me," Brooks answered quietly. "It was my duty, sir." "It was," Whitaker said, "but doing your duty when the threat comes from someone wearing a police uniform, standing just beyond your normal chain of command, requires a very specific kind of judgment and courage. Whitaker paused. I have thousands of young men and women serving on this base. Many of them look like me. I know what can happen when they leave these gates at night. I know some of the profiling and suspicion they face. His voice remained steady. What happened at the gate was not only about protecting a colonel, it was about making clear that every Marine serving here deserves to be treated lawfully and with dignity. We take care of our own, and we do it without abandoning discipline or the law. You demonstrated that perfectly. Whitaker stood and walked around the desk. He offered Brooks his hand. The young corporal took it and felt the firm, calloused grip of a combat veteran. Outstanding work, Marine. Dismissed. Brooks came to attention, turned, and left the office with quiet pride. Whitaker walked to the window and looked out across the sprawling installation. Sunlight reflected from the barracks roofs and from the distant ocean beyond them. The immediate confrontation was over. But Whitaker knew the larger fight for accountability had only begun. In the period that followed, the consequences of the gate incident spread through the local justice system. The Department of Justice led a joint task force that examined Travis Kellerman's record in detail. Special Agent Marcus Vance and his team reviewed every available arrest, traffic stop, user force report, and incident report connected to Kellerman's years on patrol. The pattern they found was disturbing. Investigators concluded that Kellerman had repeatedly focused his enforcement on minority drivers, especially young Black and Hispanic Marines traveling near the base. Reports showed questionable probable cause, unreliable field sobriety claims, and a repeated tendency to turn minor encounters into aggressive arrests. The same behavior Whitaker had experienced was not an isolated mistake. It was part of a pattern. With the evidence expanding, the federal investigation widened. District Attorney Victor Langford now faced serious exposure for his role in presenting altered dash camera footage while trying to pressure the military into releasing Kellerman. Rather than risk a lengthy federal case, Langford resigned, gave up his law license, and agreed to cooperate with investigators. Chief Gregory Halstead also found himself trapped by the evidence. The Department of Justice review raised questions about why complaints against Kellerman had been minimized, why psychological warning signs had been overlooked, and why political influence had been allowed to affect hiring and supervision. Halstead retired early under intense public scrutiny. The case against Travis Kellerman eventually moved into federal court. By then, the swagger that had defined him on patrol was gone. His uniform, badge, political protection, and department connections could no longer shield him. Kellerman stood before a federal judge wearing a standard jail uniform, his wrists secured to a waist chain. He looked pale, exhausted, and frightened. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The military surveillance footage was continuous and independent. The audio captured his words. The video established the jurisdictional boundary. The testimony of the Marines at the gate supported the recordings, and the wider civil rights investigation had uncovered a troubling history of similar conduct. Knowing he had little chance of overcoming that evidence at trial, Kellerman entered a guilty plea to the federal charges. Colonel Darius Whitaker attended the proceeding and sat quietly in the back row of the courtroom. He wore a dark civilian suit. Without medals or rank insignia, he still carried the same unmistakable presence. The judge looked directly at Kellerman before announcing the sentence. Mr. Kellerman, law enforcement officers are entrusted with extraordinary authority so they can protect the public. That authority is not permission to humiliate, intimidate, or target people based on prejudice. You allowed bias and arrogance to shape your decisions, and in doing so, you betrayed the badge, the public trust, and the basic purpose of justice. The courtroom remained silent. The judge continued. You crossed onto a federal military installation and assaulted a decorated member of the United States Armed Forces while he was compliant. Your conduct also became part of a broader pattern that harmed other people. Those actions require serious accountability. Then the sentence came down. Kellerman was sentenced to 84 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. He was permanently barred from holding a law enforcement position or public office. The gavel struck. Kellerman broke down as federal marshals took hold of his arms and led him toward the holding area. Before disappearing through the doorway, he looked back toward the gallery. For one brief moment, his eyes met Whitaker's. The colonel's expression did not change. There was no smile of victory, no gesture of revenge, no celebration. Whitaker simply watched the consequences of unchecked arrogance reach their lawful conclusion. Later, coastal fog settled over the installation again, softening the hard lines of the perimeter beneath a cool layer of mist. Whitaker sat alone, in his modest on-base quarters, with a cup of black coffee. News reports were covering Kellerman's sentencing and the results of the federal investigation. The Department of Justice review had led to 22 wrongful convictions connected to Kellerman's conduct being overturned. For once, the system had corrected itself. But Whitaker understood something uncomfortable. It had worked for him because he possessed rank, credibility, legal resources, military surveillance, and an entire protected installation behind him. He had Marines who recognized his face. He had military lawyers who knew the law. He had cameras that could not be quietly erased. He had enough institutional weight to force powerful people to listen. Many ordinary civilians had none of those things. Whitaker thought about the people who had encountered officers like Kellerman without a fortified gate nearby, without a squad of Marines watching, and without independent recordings capable of proving exactly what happened. That thought stayed with him. Set down his coffee, reached for the same worn leather jacket, and slipped his arms into the faded sleeves. Then he picked up his keys and walked outside to the dusty Ford Taurus. The familiar engine settled into a quiet hum as he drove through the installation. When he approached the main gate, the massive Delta barriers were resting flat with the pavement, ready to rise if they were ever needed again. The heavy steel gates stood open, allowing vehicles to move steadily through the entrance and exit lanes. Whitaker guided the Taurus toward the boundary and stopped just before the painted yellow line. He rolled down his window. Corporal Isaiah Brooks stepped out of the guard station with his M4 rifle secured across his chest. His posture was sharp, and his eyes moved across the perimeter with practiced attention. "Evening, Colonel," Brooks said, giving a crisp salute. Whitaker returned it with a calm hand. "Evening, Corporal. Is the perimeter secure?" "Perimeter is secure, sir," Brooks replied. "No unauthorized personnel in sight. The line is holding." A faint, knowing smile touched the young Marine's face. Whitaker nodded slowly and looked beyond the boundary toward the dark coastal highway. The road was quiet. The flashing police lights were gone. The officer who had abused his authority had been removed from the streets, and the people who tried to protect him had been forced to answer for their choices. "Keep up the good work, Marine," Whitaker said. "Semper Fidelis, sir." Whitaker rolled up the window and shifted the Taurus into drive. The car crossed the yellow line and left the fortified protection of the installation behind. Whitaker continued into the night with the same steady hands that had rested on the steering wheel during the traffic stop. I was not fearless because danger no longer existed. He was calm because he knew that fear did not have to control his choices. And that may be the most important lesson carried by everything that happened at that gate. True leadership is not simply a uniform, a title, a badge, or the authority to give orders. It is the ability to remain grounded when anger would be easier, to protect others when personal revenge would be more satisfying, and to use power with discipline when it would be tempting to use it for humiliation. Whitaker did not win because he shouted louder than Travis Kellerman. He did not win because he was physically stronger, because armed Marines surrounded the cruiser, or because powerful institutions eventually stood behind him. He won because he kept control of himself long enough for the truth to be seen clearly. Kellerman's choices also carried a lesson. Authority can magnify character. In careful hands, it can protect people, calm conflict, and build trust. In careless hands, the same authority can turn insecurity and prejudice into real harm. A badge does not erase the responsibility to listen, verify facts, and treat another human being with dignity. The people around Kellerman had choices too. Supervisors could have taken earlier complaints more seriously. Political leaders could have refused to use influence as a shield. Prosecutors could have protected the integrity of evidence instead of defending a convenient story. Each small decision helped create the conditions for a much larger failure. But the story also shows why one good decision can matter. Corporal Brooks looked closely instead of looking away. He recognized a threat, followed his duty, and acted before the situation became worse. Major Rhodes protected the evidence. Federal investigators followed the facts, and Whitaker used his position not only to defend himself, but to demand a review of cases involving people who had far less power than he did. Accountability, at its best, is not about enjoying another person's downfall. It is about preventing the same harm from reaching someone else. Forgiveness does not require pretending that harmful choices had no consequences. Compassion does not mean abandoning responsibility, and strength does not always look like retaliation. Sometimes strength is the patience to let evidence speak. Sometimes it is the courage to admit that a system failed. Sometimes it is the willingness to correct a wrong, even when doing so is embarrassing, costly, or politically inconvenient. Most of us will never command a military installation or stand at the center of a federal investigation, but everyone eventually reaches a line of some kind, a moment when pride, fear, anger, convenience, or kindness will shape what happens next. In those moments, character is revealed through choices that may seem small at first. Listen before assuming. Verify before accusing. Use authority carefully. Speak up when someone is being treated unfairly. Accept responsibility when you are wrong. And when you have enough power to protect someone who does not have the same protection, do not waste that opportunity. That is how trust is built. That is how dignity is preserved. And that is how justice becomes more than a word people say after the damage is already done. If this story of discipline, accountability, and justice kept you listening, share it with someone who believes that real strength is measured by how we treat people when we hold the advantage. And subscribe for more powerful stories about courage, responsibility, second chances, and the choices that reveal who we truly are.